In this section, we're going to cover how you can edit a macro in essentially what is a macro blind mode. In another section, we covered learning a macro live, but what if you need to make a change to that macro? Well, you could simply relearn it if you wanted to, but there's also an area in the board where you can go in and actually view the macro and make changes to it without needing to relearn it. That's in the Setup menu, so we're going to go to Setup, and it's option number 8 called Macro Editing. What macro editing allows you to do is see your macros in a table view along with the number of the macro and the commands that were recorded into it. An example that we had here was macro number 1, which is channel 1 through 10 full. So when I execute macro 1, those are the commands that are going to change. Well, let's say I wanted to make, instead of full, I wanted to make it 75%. What I can do here is I can use my soft keys again, and I can say select macro, macro number 1, and once I'm in macro number 1, now I'm editing it again. So you'll notice my enter macro key is flashing, which tells me that I am once again in edit mode, and now any button I push on the console, with the exception of a few that are designated for macro editing, are going to record into the macro. So what I can do is my arrow keys I can use to move through, and this is like working in a word processor. So I can use my right arrow and arrow over to until you see that the full is highlighted in yellow. And at this point now I can't hit clear to get rid of it because clear would simply insert a clear command into the macro. I have to use my soft key, and soft key 3 down here says delete entry. So I'm going to hit soft key 3, which deletes the entry, and now I'm left with an empty cursor, and I can type in any other new command that I want to. In this case, I want to say at 75. Now I can't hit enter. Watch what happens when I hit enter. I simply get an enter command. I can hit enter as many times as I want, and it's just going to keep putting enters in. So what I need to do is I need to use soft key 3 to delete, soft key 3 to delete the entry, and soft key 3 to delete the entry. When I am ready and finished with editing this macro, what I want to be able to do now is again, my enter macro button is flashing. I push it, and it will terminate the editing of that macro. Now, the macro will be 1 through 10 at 75. If I go to stage and I run that macro by pushing M1, instead of taking the channels to full, it takes them to 75. There are a few other commands available to you in macro editing that are not available to you when you're learning the macro live, and let's cover what those are right now. So in setup, I'm going to go to option number 8. And under more soft keys, I now have a second page of soft keys that give me a few other options here that I can do. The first two refer to the bump buttons on submasters. When I normally record a bump hit, remember any key that I push on the console is recorded into a macro, including bump button pushes. But if I use the bump buttons on the submaster, all I get in the macro is just a bump. But if I have timing associated with that bump button, I may want to specifically bump that submaster on or bump that submaster off. So I have the ability to specify an on bump or an off bump of that submaster. The next two, on and off trigger, it's a similar thing, except the trigger refers to an actual relay that is output at the back of the desk. It's like a contact closure. We're not going to cover that here. You can consult your manual when you want to talk about external triggers, but here's where you do your on trigger and your off trigger in the macro. Also, you have the ability to copy a macro here using soft key 5. You can copy a macro from, say, macro 1 to macro 10 if you want to just copy the information. Next over is enter macro. It's the same thing as the key on the keyboard. It terminates the learning command or the editing command. So if you're in this page of soft keys, you can enter the macro from here. And then over here we have macro wait, and this gives you the ability to put a couple of seconds. The macro will actually stop what it's doing and wait a couple of seconds. And I'm going to go ahead and insert a macro wait in here. I'm going to pick macro 1. I'm going to arrow over to the very end. I'm going to hit soft key 8. Macro wait. Once I do macro wait, it wants me to enter a time. I'm going to say 2 seconds. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new command that is channels 11 through 15 at full. and hit enter macro. So now what my command says is channel 1 through 10 at 75, wait 2 seconds, then take 11 through 15 at full. Each macro can have up to 99 commands, so you can build a pretty complex string of information. So let's look at that macro and see what happens. There's 75, now it's waiting, and then 2 seconds later it brings it up to full. It's important to remember that when a macro is running, only one macro can run at a time. So if you have a macro that has a long wait time, it really needs to be able to finish before you can run any other macros. And that is how you can edit macros in Blind and macro editing on your Express console.